The rain outside pattered softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the upscale Seattle restaurant, a gentle rhythm beneath the hum of celebration. Dim lights cast a warm glow over the polished wooden tables, where candles flickered in their glass holders, reflecting off the wine glasses. Laughter and chatter filled the air until it all stopped. My husband, Daniel Sullivan, stood up in the middle of the crowd, his glass of Cabernet raised a charming smile on his face. We were here to celebrate our son Liam's master's degree in finance, a moment of pride, a milestone we'd all worked toward. But Daniel's next words hit like a lightning bolt, splitting the joy in two. I've decided to start a new life without Maggie. The room froze. 30 pairs of eyes turned to me, Margaret Sullivan Maggie. To those who knew me 53 years old, the woman who'd spent 27 years holding this family together. I felt Liam sitting beside me go rigid, his black graduation sash still draped over his shoulders, a symbol of his achievement now stained by betrayal. I caught a glimpse of Rachel Bennett, Daniel's marketing consultant mistress, watching from a corner table, her presence a silent dagger. My friends, people I'd hosted for book clubs and barbecues, shifted awkwardly, their eyes darting away. They'd all known. Everyone expected me to shatter, to scream, to flee in tears. Instead, I smiled, a slow, steady smile. Congratulations on your decision, Daniel. My voice was calm, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. I reached into my bag, pulled out a slim brown envelope, and placed it beside his plate with deliberate care. His confident grin faltered, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "What's this?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Something for you to read later," I replied, my tone smooth, unshaken. I turned to Liam, whose face had turned pale, his jaw tight. I leaned over, kissed his forehead, my lips brushing against his skin. "I'm so proud of you, honey. This day it's still yours." Then I stood, adjusted my scarf, and faced the stunned guests. "Please enjoy your dinner. I wish you all a wonderful evening." I walked out, my boots echoing on the hardwood floor, feeling their gazes like a weight on my back. The glass door closed behind me, muffling the whispers that erupted in my wake. Outside, the Seattle rain kissed my face, cool and cleansing, the city lights blurred through the drizzle. For the first time in years, I felt alive. I'd taken only a few steps when the door flew open. Daniel's voice, sharp, panicked, chased after me. "Maggie, what the hell is this? What did you do?" I kept walking, a quiet smile on my lips. That envelope it held. The storm I'd been brewing, a storm that would wash away his betrayal and leave me standing in the light. I've always been good at finding discrepancies, you see, a skill honed over 27 years as an internal auditor. And Daniel, he'd left a trail of secrets I couldn't ignore. I've always been good at finding discrepancies. You see, a skill honed over 27 years as an internal auditor. And Daniel, he'd left a trail of secrets I couldn't ignore. While he chased his grand visions, 3 failed software companies, a midlife crisis that sent him on soul-searching trips to the Olympic Peninsula. I kept our family steady. I balanced our finances when he sank our savings into a friend's AI startup, a venture that collapsed in 6 months. I worked late nights at my firm, auditing corporate accounts, making sure Liam's tuition was paid, while Daniel pursued his calling as a mindfulness app developer, a calling that fizzled out faster than a Seattle summer shower. My own dream, starting a small business audit firm for women, always took a back seat. After Liam graduates, I'd tell myself, sipping coffee at dawn, the Seattle skyline shrouded in mist. After Daniel finds his footing. But with Daniel, footing was as fleeting as the morning fog on Puget Sound. 4 months ago, I noticed irregularities in our joint accounts. Small charges out of sync with our usual patterns. A round-trip ticket to San Francisco, $600. A luxury hotel stay at the Fairmont, $1,500 for 3 nights. A boutique purchase, $800 for a designer handbag I'd never seen. At first I thought it was a mistake, a clerical error maybe. But I'm not the kind of woman who lets inconsistencies slide. I've built my career on catching what others miss, so I dug deeper, quietly, systematically, like I was auditing a Fortune 500 company. I logged into our bank account after midnight, the house silent except for the drip of rain outside and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I traced the charges, cross-checked them with our credit card statements, my fingers steady on the keyboard. What I uncovered was a betrayal, sharper than the Seattle wind in winter. Daniel had been funneling money into a secret account for over a year. He'd taken Rachel to fancy rooftop bars in Belltown, bought her that handbag, even put a deposit on a waterfront condo in Tacoma, $60,000 non-refunded. All while telling me we needed to tighten our belts for retirement. We can't afford that new couch right now, Maggie. He'd said just last month, his tone clipped as we stood in our Capitol Hill kitchen. I'd nodded, trusting him, while he was wiring money to his mistress. Then I found the messages. Daniel had left his tablet on the dining table one evening, unlocked, as if he had nothing to hide. I wasn't prying, I was just clearing the table. After dinner, but a notification popped up. A text from Rachel, counting down to our fresh start, love. My heart sank a cold weight in my chest. I tapped the screen, my hands shaking, and scrolled through their chat. Messages about their future together. About how he'd finally break free. About his plan to announce our separation at Liam's graduation dinner. Knowing I'd be too stunned to react in public. She'll keep it together for appearances, he'd typed. Rachel replied, smart. Then we can move forward. I stood there, the rain tapping against the window, the smell of roasted chicken still lingering in the air, feeling like the world I'd built had crumbled. 27 years late-night budget talks, cheering at Liam's soccer games. Holding Daniel through his failures, it was all a lie. But I didn't break. Not then. I took screenshots, sent them to my email, then cleared the tablet's history, and set it back down exactly as I'd found it. Daniel walked in a moment later, humming carefree. Smells good in here, he said, pecking my cheek. I forced a smile. Thanks. What Daniel didn't know, what he never grasped, was that I'm an expert at uncovering hidden liabilities. I traced every transaction, every transfer, every charge. I built a timeline of his deception, each entry a fresh wound, but I kept going. I hired a private investigator, a sharp woman named Elena, who specialized in domestic cases. She delivered a file thicker than I'd expected, meeting me at a quiet cafe near Pike Place Market, the scent of fresh fish and flowers in the air. Photos of Daniel and Rachel strolling along Tacoma's waterfront, laughing under the gray sky. Receipts from a weekend in Portland where they'd stayed at a boutique hotel. A lease agreement for an apartment in downtown Seattle signed in both their names. Elena slid the file across the table, her voice soft. I'm sorry, Mrs. Sullivan. I know this is hard. I nodded, tucking the file into my bag, my hands steady. Thank you, I said. I wasn't crumbling, I was preparing. I pulled out the prenuptial agreement we'd signed 27 years ago, back when Daniel insisted on protecting his future success. He'd been so cautious then, a young entrepreneur with a small inheritance, terrified I'd take half if things went wrong. I'd signed it without a second thought. I loved him, believed in us. Now that document would be his ruin. Hidden in the legal jargon was an infidelity clause, one that imposed harsh financial penalties if either of us strayed. I read it in the dim light of my home office, rain streaking the window, Daniel asleep downstairs, unaware of the reckoning I was planning. The clause was solid. I met with Thomas Reed, my attorney, the next day at his office in Pioneer Square, the brick walls lined with law books. "It's watertight," Thomas said, adjusting his glasses, a faint smile on his face. "With the evidence, you've got those transactions, the messages, the photos. He'll lose the house, the retirement funds, his share of your joint assets." I nodded, stirring my tea, a quiet resolve settling over me. "Good," I said. "Let's proceed." I spent the next few months preparing, working in the shadows while Daniel planned his dramatic exit. I documented everything, every transfer, every text, every lie. I met with Thomas again to file the divorce papers, timing it with precision. I knew Daniel would wait until after Liam's graduation to make his announcement. He'd want to avoid ruining Liam's moment. Or so he'd convince himself. What he didn't know was that I'd filed the papers that very morning before his speech at the restaurant. They were safely stored in court records not yet accessible to him, but ready to strike when the time was right. I was always 3 steps ahead. Daniel thought he'd caught me off guard with his announcement, but I'd been ready for this storm longer than he could imagine. I drove to our home in Capitol Hill, a craftsman-style house we'd bought 20 years ago, back when we were partners, or so I'd believed. The house Daniel had already promised to Rachel, according to those tablet messages he didn't know I'd seen. I parked in the driveway, the familiar scent of wet cedar greeting me as I stepped out the rain, a steady drizzle. Inside, everything looked the same. The oak floors we'd refinished after a flood in '07. The gallery wall of Liam's milestones, his first piano recital, his debate team trophy, his college acceptance letter. The rocking chair in the living room where Daniel and I used to sit, planning our retirement, dreaming of sailing around the San Juan Islands. But everything had changed. The house felt like a ghost of itself, empty despite its warmth. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, the faint creak of the steps, a familiar comfort. I opened the closet, my fingers brushing against the coats I'd worn to Daniel's company launches, always the supportive wife. Behind them, hidden in the shadows, were his suitcases, packed, ready for his departure tomorrow, right after his big reveal. I stared at them, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. He'd always been obsessive about folding his shirts just right, aligning his shoes in perfect rows. But when it came to what truly mattered, he was reckless, blind. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket, texts from friends at the restaurant, from Liam, even from Daniel's sister Claire, who'd driven up from Olympia for the graduation. I pulled it out, my chest tightening at Liam's message. "Mom, are you okay? Where are you at?" I typed back quickly, my fingers steady despite the ache in my heart. "I'm okay. This isn't your burden. Enjoy your day. I love you." I'd kept Liam in the dark for months, not wanting to taint his final semester. He'd worked so hard balancing late-night study groups with a part-time gig at a coffee shop to cover his expenses, all while Daniel was siphoning money to Rachel. Liam would be upset I hadn't told him, but I knew he'd understand eventually. He had my knack for precision, my eye for detail. But he also had his father's charisma, a combination that had earned him a spot at a top bank in Portland. I couldn't let Daniel's betrayal overshadow that triumph. Not yet. I sat on the edge of our bed, the handmade quilt from our wedding day soft under my hands. Its stitches a map of a life I thought I knew. I thought about our early days. Daniel surprising me with coffee runs to the original Starbucks. The two of us hiking in Mount Rainier, laughing as we slipped on muddy trails. We'd been through so much, 3 failed companies that drained our savings. Liam's tough toddler years when he'd wake up screaming from ear infections, and Daniel would rock him for hours, humming lullabies. A car accident 10 years ago when Daniel's brakes failed on I-5, and I'd sat by his hospital bed holding his hand through the night. When had he changed, or had he always been this man? Selfish, deceitful, and I'd been too devoted to see it. I shook my head, pushing the memories away. They didn't matter now. What mattered was the plan I'd set in motion. That envelope I'd left on Daniel's plate, it wasn't just paper. It was a lifeline, a weapon, a way out of the storm. I smoothed my scarf, and headed downstairs, ready for the battle I knew was coming. 4 hours later, the sound of Daniel's car roared into the driveway tires, skidding on the wet pavement of our Capitol Hill home. The front door slammed open, the force shaking the walls. A gust of rainy Seattle air rushing in. "Maggie," he bellowed, his voice raw, a mix of rage and panic. "Where are you?" I was in the living room, perched on the edge of the rocking chair, calmly reviewing audit reports on my laptop, the glow of the screen casting shadows on the oak floors. I closed it with a soft snap as he stormed in his face, a deep shade of red, the brown envelope I'd given him, clutched tightly in his hand, crumpled at the edges. "What is this supposed to mean?" he demanded, thrusting the papers toward me, his voice shaking with fury. "You filed for divorce today, on Liam's graduation day." I looked up at him, my gaze steady, my voice calm, almost detached. "I thought it fit perfectly with your plans," I said, each word deliberate. "You wanted a fresh start. I'm just helping you along." "You had no right," he started, his voice rising, but I cut him off sharp and unwavering. "I had every right, just as you had every right to choose Rachel. We all make our choices, Daniel." His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket, a sharp vibration that sliced through the tension. He glanced at it, then ignored it, but I knew who it was. Rachel, no doubt wondering why he wasn't at the apartment they'd leased together, the one he'd promised her as their new beginning. He tried a different approach, his tone shifting to something smug, almost patronizing. "That prenup had expired years ago," he said, crossing his arms, a flicker of confidence in his eyes. "Any lawyer will tell you that." I allowed myself a small smile, the kind that made his certainty waver. Actually, it didn't. Section 14 states the infidelity clause remains in effect for the duration of the marriage. Your lawyer should have told you that. "Oh wait, you didn't bother to hire one, did you?" The blood drained from his face, his smugness replaced by a dawning horror. The prenup he'd insisted on to protect himself would now strip him of everything: the house, the retirement funds, his share of our joint assets. His dramatic announcement at the restaurant had just become the costliest mistake of his life. "You can't do this to me," he said, his voice breaking, as he sank onto the couch, his hands trembling. "We built this life together." I tilted my head, studying him, my tone cool. "And you chose to tear it down, just not the way you expected." His phone buzzed again, more insistent this time. He looked at it, let out a groan, his shoulders slumping. "Problem?" I asked, a hint of amusement in my voice. "Rachel's at the apartment already," he muttered almost to himself. "She's moved her stuff in." I couldn't help but smile, a quiet, knowing smile. "The apartment you put in both your names, the lease you signed last month." He nodded, still dazed, oblivious to the trap I'd set. "You might want to check with the leasing office," I said, my voice deceptively casual. "That application was flagged for discrepancies, never finalized. The agent called our landline to verify. I took care of it. His eyes widened, a mix of shock and dread washing over him. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I stood gathering my bag and a small overnight case I'd packed earlier. "You have until tomorrow evening to get your things out," I said, my voice firm. "After that, the locks will be changed." As I walked toward the door, Daniel called after me, his voice desperate, pleading. "What about Liam? Have you thought about how this affects him?" I stopped my hand on the doorknob, anger finally breaking through my calm exterior. "Don't you dare use our son as an excuse, Daniel. You weren't thinking about him when you were planning your waterfront life with Rachel." I stepped outside the Seattle rain, cool against my skin, and drove across town to Claire's house near the University of Washington, where she worked as a freelance journalist. The city lights shimmered through the drizzle, the Space Needle a faint silhouette in the distance. Claire greeted me at the door with a warm hug, her arms a safe harbor in the storm. "I just heard from Liam," she said, pulling me inside, her voice thick with worry. "Are you okay?" I let out a shaky breath, the weight of the day settling into my bones. "Better than I thought I'd be," I admitted, following her to the kitchen. A bottle of Chardonnay sat on the counter, 2 glasses already, poured, condensation beating on the stems. "I can't believe Daniel made such a scene," Claire said, handing me a glass, her eyes dark with anger. "Right there in front of everyone at Liam's graduation dinner. He's lost it." I took a sip, the wine crisp and cold, a sharp contrast to the damp warmth of the evening. "It was meant to humiliate me," I explained, setting the glass down. "A public rejection, so I couldn't fight back without looking unhinged." Claire's face tightened, her lips a thin line. "My brother always had a flair for drama, but this, it's beyond anything I expected." We sat in her cozy living room, surrounded by stacks of notebooks and newspaper clippings, the windows fogged with the rain outside. Claire had always been a free spirit, never married her life, a tapestry of stories and adventures. I'd envied her freedom over the years, the ability to chase her passions without compromise. What was in that envelope that got him so rattled? She asked, her curiosity cutting through the quiet. I took another sip of wine, then met her gaze. "The divorce filing," I said. "Proof of his financial misconduct. And most importantly, the prenup that'll leave him with almost nothing." Claire's eyes widened, a sharp laugh escaping her. "The prenup, I remember him obsessing over it. Dad had just given him that startup loan, and he was terrified of losing it. The irony, it's almost too perfect." My phone rang, the sound piercing the stillness. Liam's name lit up the screen. I took a deep breath before answering. "Mom," he said, his voice strained on the edge of breaking. "I'm coming to Aunt Claire's." I tried to stop him, not wanting to drag him into this mess. "Honey, you don't have to." But he cut me off, his tone resolute. "I'm already on my way. Dad's telling everyone you've gone crazy, that you've been planning this for months. He's saying awful things." I closed my eyes, exhaustion seeping into me. Of course he was. Daniel always spun the story to make himself the victim. "Let him talk," I said, my voice steady. "The truth will come out soon enough." 20 minutes later, Liam arrived, still in his graduation suit. His tie undone, his eyes red and glassy. He fell into my arms, his body trembling, just like he did as a child after a bad dream. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice muffled against my shoulder, a mix of hurt and anger. I pulled back, cupping his face, my heart aching for him. "I didn't want to ruin your final semester," I said softly. "You worked so hard for this day." He stepped back, wiping his eyes, his jaw clenched. "Well, Dad made sure to ruin it anyway." We sat on Claire's couch, the 3 of us huddled together, a plate of cookies on the coffee table, a small gesture of comfort in a day of chaos. I told Liam everything, how I'd uncovered the affair, the financial deceit, the plans Daniel and Rachel had made for their new life. I showed him the messages, the bank records, the photos from Elena, the investigator. Liam's face darkened as he listened, his hands tightening into fists. I knew something was wrong with Dad, he said, his voice low, almost a growl. He's been distant always on his phone, disappearing for work trips. But I never thought this. Claire reached over, squeezing his shoulder, her voice gentle. None of us want to see these things in the people we love. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas, my attorney. The emergency filing was approved. The accounts I'd flagged were frozen, pending the divorce proceedings. Daniel now had limited access to funds, just enough for necessities, not enough for the condo he'd promised Rachel in Tacoma. I showed the message to Liam and Claire, a quiet triumph settling over me. Good, Liam said, his voice hard, his eyes fierce with loyalty. He deserves it. Good, Liam said, his voice hard, his eyes fierce with loyalty. He deserves it. My son's fierce support warmed me, but I wasn't blind to the complexity of his feelings. He's still your father, I said softly, my hand resting on his arm. Your relationship with him, it's separate from what's happening between us. Liam shook his head, his jaw tight, his voice low. Maybe one day. But right now I can't even look at him. He hugged me this morning, told me he was proud, all while planning to destroy our family hours later. The doorbell rang, a sharp chime that cut through the heavy air in Claire's living room. Claire stood, her brow furrowed, and went to answer it. She returned moments later, her voice tense. It's Daniel, and he's not alone. I steadied myself, smoothing my sweater, as Claire led Daniel and Rachel into the room. Rachel looked nervous, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse, her auburn hair catching the soft light, her eyes scanning the space. She was 36, polished in a way that screamed effortless confidence until now. Daniel, on the other hand, was a storm of anger. His earlier panic had solidified into rage. His face red, his fists clenched at his sides. Maggie, you need to stop this nonsense, he demanded, his voice booming through the room. Unfreeze the accounts. We can talk like reasonable people. Liam stood, stepping slightly in front of me, his body taut with protective energy. Maybe you should have acted reasonable before announcing you were leaving Mom in front of everyone. Daniel's eyes widened as if just noticing our son. Liam, this doesn't involve you. Doesn't involve me. Liam repeated, his voice rising sharp with disbelief. You destroyed our family on my graduation day, and it doesn't involve me. Rachel touched Daniel's arm, her voice hesitant, almost pleading. Daniel, maybe we should go. He jerked away from her, his movements abrupt. No, I'm not leaving until Maggie agrees to be rational. Claire crossed her arms, her expression cold, her tone cutting. My sister-in-law seems to be the only rational one here. You're the one who made this mess, Daniel. I stayed seated, watching the scene unfold, a quiet strength anchoring me. For years, I'd been the mediator, the one who fixed problems, kept the peace. That role had drained me. I'd finally set it down. The accounts will remain frozen until the preliminary hearing. I said, my voice calm, measured. That's in 3 days. The judge will handle the asset division then. Daniel sputtered, his face turning a deeper shade of red. 3 days? What am I supposed to do for 3 days? I tilted my head, my tone even. You have your personal account, the one you've been funneling money into for the past year. That should be enough. Rachel's head snapped toward Daniel, her eyes narrowing, her voice sharp. You have a separate account. How much is in it? The question lingered heavy with suspicion. Clearly, Daniel hadn't been entirely truthful with Rachel either. He ignored her, his focus still on me. "This is cruel, Maggie. This isn't you." I met his gaze unflinching. "Maybe you never really knew me, just as I apparently never really knew you." Liam turned to Rachel, his voice low laced with anger. "Did you know he was going to announce it like that at my graduation dinner?" Rachel's cheeks flushed, her eyes dropping to the floor, her voice small. "I thought he was going to talk to your mom privately. The announcement today, it caught me off guard too." Daniel shot her a betrayed look, the cracks in their partnership growing wider. "I think you both should leave, Claire," said her voice firm, leaving no room for debate. "You've upset Liam enough for one day." Daniel tried one last plea, his tone softening, almost desperate. "Liam, you understand that relationships change, right? Sometimes people grow apart." Liam's face hardened, a cold fury in his eyes I'd never seen before. "What I understand is that you're a coward who couldn't even give Mom the respect of a private conversation. What I understand is that you were stealing from our family, while I worked weekends at a coffee shop to pay for my books because you said money was tight." Daniel paled, his mouth opening, then closing, no words coming out. "That's not how it was." He finally managed, his voice weak. "It's exactly how it was," Liam snapped. "Please leave, Dad. I can't look at you right now." The silence that followed was heavy. Liam's words, a wall between them. Finally, Daniel turned to go Rachel, following her, head bowed. At the door, he paused, looking back at me, his voice low. "This isn't over, Maggie. I'll fight you on this." I met his gaze, steady and resolute. "You're welcome to try." After they left, Liam sank beside me on the couch, tears streaming down his face, his hands shaking. "I've never spoken to Dad like that," he whispered, his voice breaking. I wrapped my arm around him, pulling him close, my heart aching for his pain. "Sometimes standing up for what's right, it hurts," I said softly, brushing a hand through his hair. Claire brought us fresh glasses of wine, her movements gentle, a small smile on her lips. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass, the faint clink a quiet promise. I raised mine in return, the Seattle rain a steady rhythm outside. Indeed, this ending was the beginning of something brighter. The preliminary hearing took place on a drizzly Tuesday morning at the King County Courthouse. I arrived with Thomas, my attorney, while Daniel showed up with a young lawyer from a firm that handled tech contracts, not family law. Another miscalculation in his rushed plan. The judge, a woman with a sharp gaze and a no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed the prenup carefully, her pen tapping lightly on the desk. "This document appears valid," she said, her voice crisp, authoritative. "Do you contest its enforceability?" Daniel's lawyer, a jittery young man in a cheap suit, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we believe the agreement has expired due to the passage of time." The judge adjusted her glasses, reading aloud. "Section 19 states the duration is for the term of the marriage, plus any legal proceedings resulting from its dissolution. There is no expiration indicated." Daniel leaned forward, whispering frantically to his lawyer, who looked increasingly uneasy, sweat beading on his brow. Furthermore, the judge continued, "The evidence of systematic fund transfers violates the financial transparency requirements in Section 25. She flipped through the papers, then looked up. "I am ruling to maintain the freeze on joint accounts pending full financial discovery. Mr. Sullivan's personal account will remain accessible to him. The family home will remain in Mrs. Sullivan's possession during proceedings as stipulated in the prenup's infidelity clause." Daniel's face turned a deep shade of crimson, his hands gripping the table. "This is ridiculous," he muttered loud enough for me to hear across the room. The judge shot him a stern look, her voice cutting. "Mr. Sullivan, I suggest you review the agreement you signed more carefully." This court will reconvene in 30 days for the full hearing after discovery is complete. As we left the courtroom, Daniel caught up to me in the hallway. His steps quick, his voice low. "Maggie, please, we need to talk about this like adults. 27 years together, it has to mean something." I stopped, turning to face him, my expression calm but firm. "It meant everything. Until you decided it didn't." I walked away, leaving him standing alone in the courthouse hallway, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Word spread quickly through our social circle, a wildfire of whispers and speculation. Friends called daily, some offering support, others digging for gossip to share at their next brunch. I kept my responses short, my voice steady. "Daniel and I are separating. These things happen." Meanwhile, Daniel's carefully crafted image, successful tech founder, devoted family man, fell apart like a sandcastle in the tide. The financial freeze meant he couldn't keep his promises to Rachel. The Tacoma condo deal collapsed, the deposit forfeited. The new Tesla he'd ordered was repossessed, the dealership calling to confirm the cancellation. 2 weeks after the hearing, Claire called me, her voice tinged with amusement as she shared the latest. "Guess what? Rachel moved out." I set down my coffee mug on the kitchen counter, a small smile tugging at my lips. Already I wasn't surprised, but the speed was impressive. Apparently she found out Daniel's company is barely afloat. Claire said, a laugh in her voice. "The big savings he bragged about, they're gone." She told her friend Sophie she didn't sign up to date a man with financial troubles. I laughed, the sound light freeing. "He always was good at spinning stories," I said, shaking my head. While Daniel struggled, I rebuilt. The financial security I'd kept in my separate accounts, ones Daniel never knew about, gave me a freedom he hadn't expected. I leased a small office in South Lake Union, a modern space with exposed brick walls and a view of Lake Union, the water shimmering under Seattle's gray sky. I launched Sullivan Audits, a consulting firm for small businesses, led by women focusing on financial transparency and risk management. My first clients were 3 women starting over after messy divorces, their stories resonating with mine in ways that felt both painful and empowering. Word of mouth spread quickly, bringing more clients through my door. I helped women navigate their finances, divorce, loss, new beginnings, guiding them with the same precision I'd used to uncover Daniel's lies. The work filled me with purpose, each success a step toward healing, a reminder that I was creating something meaningful from the wreckage of my past. Liam, who'd started his banking job in Portland, called me often, his voice warm with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," he said one evening, his words crackling through the phone. "You're helping people through their toughest moments." I smiled, standing in my office, the Seattle skyline glowing in the twilight. "I'm just doing what I wish someone had done for me sooner," I replied. Helping women weather their storms, being valued for my expertise, not just my nurturing, felt like stepping into a new skin, one that fit me better than the old. The final divorce hearing fell on what would have been our 28th anniversary, a date that once held memories of rainy picnics by Lake Washington and quiet promises under the stars. Now it marked the closing of a chapter that had spanned nearly 3 decades. Daniel arrived at the courthouse looking worn, his suit rumpled, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. I later learned his company had folded entirely without my financial oversight, his investors pulling out when they heard about the divorce. Rachel was long gone now, dating a venture capitalist from Bellevue, her Instagram filled with photos of wine tastings and designer shoes. Most of our mutual friends had distanced themselves from Daniel after the full story emerged, their invitations to holiday parties and Mariners games quietly fading. The judge upheld the prenup in its entirety, her ruling swift and final. Daniel left with his personal belongings, his failed business, and the money in his private account, which after paying his attorney was barely enough for a small apartment in a less desirable part of Seattle. I retained our Capitol Hill home, my retirement accounts, and 70% of our joint investments exactly as the prenup dictated in cases of infidelity. The justice felt like a quiet rain after a storm cleansing inevitable. The very document Daniel had insisted on to protect himself had become his undoing. As we left the courtroom, Daniel approached me one last time. His steps hesitant, his voice soft. I made a terrible mistake. He said, his eyes searching mine for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe a trace of the love we'd once had. Is there any chance I cut him off? My voice, gentle but firm, a door closing softly. No, that door is closed. He nodded, his shoulders sagging, a quiet acceptance in his gaze. I understand, he said, and for once I believed he did. I hope you find happiness, Maggie. You deserve it. It was perhaps the first honest thing he'd said to me in years, a small gesture in the ruins of our past. I gave him a faint nod, then turned and walked away. The sound of my boots echoing in the marble hallway of the courthouse. 6 months later, Sullivan Audits was thriving. A lifeline for women across Seattle and beyond. I'd moved to a larger office, a bright space with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a small patio where I could sip my morning coffee, watching the ferries glide across Elliott Bay. I hired 2 associates, both women, both dedicated to empowering others, and together we built a community. My clients ranged from single mothers to entrepreneurs starting over, after betrayal, each one a testament to resilience. Liam visited often, his banking job in Portland keeping him busy, but he always made time to stop by, often bringing pastries from his favorite bakery near Pioneer Square. You know what's ironic, he said one afternoon as we sat on my patio. The Seattle rain, a gentle mist around us. If Dad had just been honest from the start, he might have kept half of everything. I nodded, taking a sip of my latte, the city skyline a canvas of gray and green. Sometimes people can't see. Beyond the moment, I replied, my voice soft, reflective. The woman who'd once defined herself as Daniel's wife, as Liam's mother, had found a new identity, one forged in the rain and fire of betrayal. Auditor, entrepreneur, advocate. That envelope I'd handed Daniel at the restaurant wasn't just a plan for survival. It was the light that guided me through the storm, a beacon to a life I'd never dared to dream of. Behind it, I found not just justice but rebirth. In securing my future, I'd reclaimed something far more precious. Myself. I stood on the patio, the Seattle rain washing away the past, the city stretching out before me, a promise of brighter days ahead.